All right, so for this game, we have a few things to keep track of. We've got a bunch of films that we have to assign, and we have to assign them to, I guess you could say, two different parameters. We have to assign them to different time slots and to different theaters. Now, the time slots themselves are a bit of a sequential component, so we can let that kind of drive the base of the chart. So across the top, we basically just have 1, 2, and 3 o'clock. And we also have to keep track of different theaters. Now, what's going to happen is that each of these times is going to have one movie in the East Theater and one movie in the West Theater. So we can set up essentially two tiers to keep track of that, basically an East tier and a West tier. So that way we have basically 1 o'clock for East, 1 o'clock for West, and so on and so forth. It also helps you keep track of similar things together. So all of the 1 o'clocks are here, all of the 2 o'clocks are here, and then you can also look at the East Theater across and the West Theater across, and so on and so forth. So the elements themselves happen to be G, M, O, and then we have P, S, and U, and the rules. So the first rule says that S has to go into the West Theater. So I guess we can even leave ourselves a reminder here on the board that S is going to be in the West Theater. Next, we're told that U has to be in the East Theater. So U has to be in the East Theater, so we can lock that into place. Next, we're told that M has to go before both O and P, so M has to go prior to O and P. Now, it's worth noting that we don't know the relative order of these two elements, right? We only know that M happens to be before both of them, but relative to each other, that could still go either way. And lastly, we're told that U has to go before G. And that's kind of worth recognizing, I guess, because we already know that U has to go into the East Theater, and it certainly can't go last, so I guess U is going to be stuck somewhere in these two positions. It's also worth noting that M happens to be especially restrictive, well, a little more so just because it has two people after him. That said, though, I mean, those two people, P and O, could potentially both go at 3 o'clock, so we could arguably fit M somewhere at 2 o'clock or at 1 o'clock, so we have a little bit of flexibility there. It might also be worth looking at the other end, which is that the first position, it's worth noting that there's not a lot of people left who can go first. Namely, O, P, and G certainly couldn't go first, which means that the only people that could go first are M and U, and also S, who is mostly a wild card, although, well, not really, because S still has to go somewhere in the West Theater. So arguably speaking, we could actually even leave ourselves a reminder here that the only people that can go into that first position that are left are S, M, and U. So from there, this doesn't seem like it would be worth exhausting. There's nothing really to latch onto. So let's take a look at the questions themselves and see what we can do with them. Question number 1, in this case, actually happens to be a local question, so we'll start with this one. And to be fair, you should always start the first question first, no matter what. So the question says, if personnel is scheduled for 2 o'clock in the West Theater. Well, let's try this out. So if personnel is at 2 o'clock in the West Theater, I guess the question is, what does that tell us? Well, first of all, I guess we know that M has to go before the P, so M is going to be sometime at 1 o'clock, although he could arguably still go at either the East or the West Theater. We don't know how that quite works, so M will just go somewhere there. Beyond that, though, this is actually quite open. I mean, we still could have both S and U in position 1, depending on which theater they go into, and then G, O, they still have some flexibility here, so it doesn't actually seem like we know much more. Let's take a look and see what we can do with what we have. The question asks, which of the following must be true? A, G is at 3 o'clock, and we don't seem to know that. Answer choice B, management is at 1 o'clock, and actually, yes, management right now does in fact have to go into 1 o'clock. So the best answer to question number 1 is answer choice B. Next, question 2 is global. We'll come back to that one in a second. Let's take a look at question number 3. So number 3 asks, if G is at 3 o'clock in the East Theater, so we have G in the East Theater at 3 o'clock. So the question now becomes, what does that tell us? Well, first of all, as we said, U obviously has to go before the G, but that still leaves U wide open, right? Because you can still go into either 1 or 2 in the East Theater. What else can we do? Well, when it comes to these guys, it's actually worth noting that O and P can no longer both go into 3 o'clock, because G is going to take up one of those slots, which means that there's really no way anymore to place M into 2, because if M was to go into 2, then you'd have to fit both O and P at 3 o'clock, and that wouldn't quite work for us, which means M at the moment, we don't know exactly which theater he's in, but he will definitely have to go into 1 o'clock somewhere. Next, outside of that, it looks like, again, we have a little bit of flexibility, right? U will have to go in the east as usual, S in the west. I mean, O and P are going to have to go somewhere in 2 or 3, but again, that's pretty open. Let's see what we can do with the question itself. Each of the following could be true except, so what is impossible? Answer choice A, management is at 2 o'clock in the East Theater. Well, no, because we know that management has to be at 1 o'clock. There's no way for management to be at 2 o'clock at all. So the best answer to question number 3 happens to be A. Next, question 4 is global. We'll come back to that one momentarily. Let's take a look at question number 5. So if U is presented at 2 o'clock, well, let's see what we can do. If U happens to be at 2 o'clock, well, first of all, we already know that U always has to go into the East Theater. So U is going to be at 2 o'clock in the East Theater. Moreover, if U is at 2 o'clock, we know that U has to go before G. Now, we don't exactly know where the G goes because he can still go between either theater, but I guess we can say that G will go somewhere at 3 o'clock, one way or the other. Now, beyond that, can we do much more? Well, we actually kind of have a similar situation to what we had in the previous question, which is that you'll notice that if G is at 3 o'clock, there's no way to fit both O and P at 3 o'clock anymore, which further means there's no way to fit M into 2, because if M was to go into 2, you'd have to fit O and P here, and that's not going to work. So we know that M is certainly going to go into 1 o'clock one way or the other. Now from there, again, it seems like we're a little bit flexible. So O and P are going to have to... Actually, we can take one more step here. We know that O and P have to follow M, right? So M is going to be before both O and P, which means one of them is going to go over here and one of them is going to join G, but that is going to lock these spaces down, right? Because we're going to have basically in these 4 positions, you're going to have U, G, and then O and P somewhere over here, which means that S actually can't go into any of these slots. That means that S, who has to go into the West Theater, is going to have to go at 1 o'clock, more specifically 1 o'clock in the West Theater. In fact, M, we can adjust. M is going to have to go at 1 o'clock in the East Theater. So the question itself now asks, each of the following could be true except A, G is at 3 o'clock. Well, that's definitely true, so we can definitely disqualify answer choice A from the options. B, management is at 2 o'clock, and that certainly cannot be true because we just said that M has to be at 1. The best answer to question number 5 then becomes answer choice B. Next, question number 6. If management is at 2 o'clock in the East Theater, well, let's see what we can do with that information. If we have management at, it was 2 o'clock in the East Theater, I guess the question as usual becomes, what does that mean for us? What does that tell us? Well, we certainly know that O and P have to follow M, which means that O and P are going to go at 3 o'clock. We just don't quite know who's going to go into what theater. Now from there, we still know that U has to go before the G, which means that the only way that that could work is for U to go into the East Theater at number 1, because U has to go into the East Theater. And then G is going to have to go into the only remaining position that's after, which is the West Theater at 2 o'clock. And then that leaves us with S, who has to go into the first position in the West Theater. So the question now asks, which of the following cannot be true? Let's take a look. A, goals is at 2. Well, in fact, it is. So that is certainly going to be true. Answer choice B, sales is at 2 o'clock, and no, that is certainly impossible. Sales can't go at 2 o'clock because currently, obviously, it's at 1. So best answer to number 6 then is answer choice B. Next, 7 is our standard modifier question, so we're going to come back to that one in just a moment. Let's take a look at the 2 global questions that we had. Question number 2 says, which of the following cannot be true? Well, let's take a look. Answer choice A, G is earlier than M. So could we ever have essentially G running earlier than M? Well, yeah, you'll notice that that's not going to work, is it now? Because if you had G earlier than M, that would mean you're going to have U before G, who is going to go before M, who is also then before O and P, which means that's a string of at least 4 different times, right? You would just do symbolically U before G before M before O and P. And we don't have 4 time slots to work with. There's no way to make this string happen, which means answer choice A is pretty much a perfect answer choice for us. The best answer for what cannot be true for number 2 is in fact A. Lastly, question number 4. How many of the films are there, any one of which could be presented at 3 o'clock? Well, let's start with what we know. We've definitely seen O, P, as well as G go into 3 o'clock. So we definitely know that there are at least 3 that can go at 3 o'clock. So we can cross off answer choice A from the board because we can do at least 3. Moreover, 3 o'clock certainly would not work for either M or U because they have to go before somebody, which means that we can cross off 6 and 5, E and D, because we certainly can't have, we have at least 2 people that cannot go into 3 o'clock. So now the only question becomes, can we get a 4th person? And the only person outstanding is S. So the question becomes, could we have S go at 3 o'clock? Well, let's just kind of quickly play it out and see what happens. If S goes into 3 o'clock in the West theater, because S is always in the West theater, what would that tell us? Well, one thing we can take one more step here. We know that earlier we said the only people that can go first are S, M, and U, which means that now that S is out of the picture, U is going to have to go first and M is going to have to go first. And because U is always in the East theater, we know that that's the theater that he's going to be in. So that takes care of that. And then from here, I mean, we actually have complete flexibility. O, P, and G just have to go somewhere after U and M, but they can really just shuffle anywhere between these 3 slots, which means could S go into that 3rd position? Absolutely. The best answer to question number 4 then becomes C. And lastly, our modifier question. So this one asks, what would essentially properly replace the rule that says that S goes into the West theater? So we're trying to replace this rule over here. Now, just as a recap, remember, a good answer choice is going to be something that always had to be true, because if the answer choice doesn't have to be true, if it didn't always have to be true, then it would present a further restriction that never existed. That would mean that that's not the same effect. And the other side of it is you want to make sure that it guarantees the result, namely in this case, it has to guarantee that S will actually always go into the West theater. So the question itself, I guess the answer choice is here. A, sales must be earlier than goals. So the thing is, did that have to be true that S goes before G? I mean, you'll notice that, for example, in the last scenario that we had, O, P, and G could have easily shuffled between these 3 positions. So arguably speaking, couldn't we easily have had S and G go at the same time? Yeah, this never had to be true, and I mean, it doesn't really seem like it would do anything in terms of proving that S is in the West side, but regardless, this never had to be true, so answer choice A then gets disqualified from our options. Next, answer choice B. Sales cannot be presented in the same theater as goals. Same problem. Did that have to be true, that S cannot be in the same theater as goals? In fact, we just said we could have easily had S and G in this position where goals went into the 3rd time slot, in which case B never had to be true. We can get rid of it. Next, C. Sales cannot be presented in the same theater as U. Well, actually, that would work pretty well, wouldn't it? Because if S can't be in the same theater as U, and we've already nailed down that U has to go into the East theater, well, that means that S can't go into the East theater, which leaves it in the West theater. So this always had to be true because they're obviously in different theaters. And if they can't be in the same theater, and given that U is in the East, that would lock down that S is in the West, which means answer choice C is a perfect answer choice to question number 7.